to do is step through very, very quickly what the permit by rule is, and then I want to give an opportunity for a lot more feedback from you all as to what issues and concerns you might have. So, background, doesn't matter, we're long past that. They put the regulation, they put the law in place a number of years ago, we've got the reg. We really didn't get our first project until 2015. So, what exactly is a permit by rule? For those of you that are familiar with your regular conditional use permits or special use permits at the county level, you identify all kinds of criteria, the applicant says okay, and you check them off, you're good to go. That's not the permit by rule. The permit by rule is already established. The regulation has already gone through public comment. Essentially what it means is if the applicant supplies all the criteria that's listed in the regulation, they got a permit. Now, one of those criteria is public comment, and oftentimes with your conditional use permit, you have the experience of saying, well, you know, the developer says, I got that uncertainty, is the public comment period going to derail my project if they decide they don't want it? During the permit by rule process, there is a public comment requirement as part of the regulation. The applicant conducts those comments, take those comments, they're supposed to respond to those comments, and all of that comes in as part of the application package. But the way the General Assembly structured this permitting program, all we do is determine whether the application is complete, because in essence, that application is the permit. So there isn't a staff at VDEQ that's working through some kind of permit exercise with the applicant. What we do is review the criteria that they submit as part of the specific items under the regulation. So that's the difference between a permit by rule and a conditional or a special use permit. So what are those components? Many of them are very straightforward. Many of them are self-certification. Many of them the applicants can take care of in about 30 minutes. Others may take months and months and months. Depends on the location, how large the facility is, and what they encounter as they begin to go through these analyses. So the first one is a notice of intent. You can find every one of those that our agency has received posted on our webpage. I apologize up front, we know this is a difficult, there's like 90 of them listed right now. It's very unruly, nobody expected that volume to come in as quickly as it has. You all might not be aware of this, but our website was hacked a couple of months ago, maybe about 4 or 5 months ago. There's still an awful lot of links and things that aren't working, but we are trying very much to provide a mechanism, because we've got so many now, and it's my hope that in the next 6 to 8 weeks, that website is going to be searchable, so you could be able to search them by projects proposed by county, by size, by contractor, the various components, the acreage, those kinds of things will be able to be evaluated so you can have a better tool to help you all figure out what's coming your way. The local government certification, this is key because you are the siting authority, not the state. If that applicant can't get local approval, they don't get a PBR. It's that straightforward and it's that simple. So what this means is that the bulk of activity that's going on in your localities right now, chances are the state isn't even aware of it. We have right now about 90 notices of intent, but what I'm being told is that's just the tip of the iceberg, because nobody wants to let the state know until they've gotten local government approval, and there's no way for us to have any idea what's percolating in all of your counties and what kinds of projects may or may not be coming forward in the future. So the siting authority rests with you. If the developer can't meet your conditions or your concerns, then they're not going to get a permit from us. The other thing that's required are the interconnection studies and the interconnection agreement. This is so that the developers have got some skin in the game. To get those studies done, whether it's through Dominion as the local transmission owner, or whether it's through PJM, or maybe it's through both, those feasibility impact studies are very, very costly. And unlike DEQ, PJM can actually charge a whole boatload of money. And they have a very strict time frame. So if you get on the PJM grid, or on their queue, and they do the feasibility study and they say, yeah, this is feasible, you can do this. For us to do the suitability study, we need $600,000 over the next 30 days. And if you don't make that payment, then you go to the end of the line and you start all over again. So by requiring these kinds of monetary commitments, we're not spending our time evaluating projects that have no hope of going forward, because there's just me. So this ensures that what we're looking at are projects that really have a pretty good likelihood of going forward. There needs to be a certification that the project does not exceed 150 megawatts. That was a change that the General Assembly made, not just this past session, but a year ago, and they increased the megawattage for the size of the project from 100 to 150. There's an analysis of NATS required. There are no impacts of pollutants, at least as far as emitting air pollutants from these particular facilities once they're operating. But what the analysis does provide is an analysis of how many tons of NOx could be avoided once this 20 or 40 or 80 megawatt facility goes in. How many pounds of CO2, how much NOx is potentially going to not be generated because we're going this route as opposed to a baseload natural gas facility. There are two areas where there's analysis for impacts to natural resources, and that's DEQ's primary focus. One of them has to do with wildlife, state T&E species, certain and endangered species, and the other one has to do with cultural resources. The wildlife tends to have the biggest analysis and impacts with regard to wind projects. Remember, this is the bulk of everything we've permitted. Everything except one project has been a solar project, but we have permitted a wind project a couple years ago in Botetourt County. But the cultural resource analysis is key, and it's big, and it can be costly depending on where somebody's looking to locate and how big the project is. Those get coordinated through Game and Inland Fisheries, Department of Historic Resources, and if there is a potential for significant impact to those resources, then the applicant's required to generate a mitigation plan that also then has to go through approval with DHR and DEQ prior to us deeming the application complete. There's an evaluation as to whether or not the project, where it's located, whether it's in the coastal avian protection zone, that's a mapped out area that's clearly delineated within the regulations. They need to provide an operating plan. If they're going to have sheep grazing, we need to know about that. If the project is going to plant mostly native pollinators so that they don't have an exorbitant cost in annual maintenance fees for mowing grass, we need to know that. Because in 3 or 4 years, when we come back to enforce that and look at that facility, and they committed to growing pollinators and they're cutting grass, well, now we have a violation of permit. So the operating plan will clearly identify exactly how they expect this facility to operate. And as you all well know, many of these projects are packaged and then sold to somebody else. Whoever buys that project is also bound by whatever commitments have been established in those application documents. They include a site map and a context map, so there's a clear delineation of exactly where it's at and what's going on. There's a certification as to whether or not they are a public utility or not. Again, a lot of these, we've got the forms, they sign them, they're self-certifications. However, if one decides they want to fudge some information in their application, we do have by law and enforcement authority and penalties up to it's $35,000 a day. So these are the same enforcement provisions that come with all our stationary source air emission projects, whether they be a large utility or they be a craft pulp mill or whatever. So those fines that are potential to be levied are massive. They're right in parity with any of our major source and our major polluters within the state. So, these self-certification forms look pretty straightforward, but they do carry the force of law. They are a permit, and the conditions in them are enforceable. As I mentioned, there's the public comment requirement, and so it goes something like this. I'm a developer, I get 13 of those, because I haven't paid my fee yet. I get 13 of those components all together, and I make them available for 30 days for the public to review and look at. And after about midway through that 30-day comment period, I'm also required to hold a public meeting and take comment during that meeting, as well as any written comment or anything that might come in during that 30-day period. I respond to those comments, and I package that all up in a summary report with verification that we had the hearings and we did all this stuff, and that becomes part of the application package as well. They submit the permit fee. Once they submit the package to us, this is the fee structure. You can see it's broken down by megawatts. I should mention that the agency has been, we've had some internal discussions that really this should be broken down by acreage, because it's really the acreage impact as far as assessing the real environmental impact, not just how efficient somebody's panels are. So we will be, in the very near future, reopening these PBR regulations to address not only the permit fees and how they're structured, but a whole host of other issues. Now that the program's been out and about for about 3 years, we've got some operating experience where we can see there are some things that need to change, and we very much want to make sure that you all that have had some opportunity working with this permitting process at the local level can provide some additional input to us as we move forward when we open the rule. So here's where we stand as of the beginning part of this month. We've issued 25 PBRs since 2015. There's a breakdown of the various number of permits according to the last several years. We currently have 9 projects in operation that I'm aware of. That's one of the problems. There is no notification requirement as to when any of these become operational, when they can start construction or anything. So it's some of the things we want to address in the rule. Based on those 9 projects, we have 320 megawatts currently in operation. The number of 54, the pending notices of intent, is kind of deceiving, because as I mentioned, the bulk of activity is going on at your level that we're not aware of yet. So we estimate that number of really active potential facilities is probably 3 to 4 times that size, particularly if we're going to get to 3,000 megawatts over the next couple of years. And based on the notices and the permits that we've issued thus far, we've got a total of about 3,000 megawatts projected and operational. So again, the limits of our authority are pretty much centered around your activities at the local level and site, because we have no authority over that at all. We have no authority over transmission. So if a facility wants to locate over 300 acres, but they've got to run a transmission line 2.5 miles to be able to tap into the grid, guess who doesn't permit that transmission line? We don't. That's State Corporation Commission. They have authority over transmission. So as these projects get bigger and bigger and get further and further from easy tap-in access points to the grid, we're going to find that we're going to have this almost a dual permitting process as it stands right now. We'll issue the PBR for the fence line that encompasses the connection point, but the transmission to tap into the grid, if it's many, many miles away, is going to need to be something that will be permitted by the State Corporation Commission. And of course, stormwater permitting, handled under DEQ in some jurisdictions, handled locally in others. And so that again is a separate permitting issue from the actual PBR. So according to the PBR, and I don't want you to walk away and say, well, what's the point of that public comment if we can't have some meaningful input in the process? And I'm here to tell you, you can, because we've had many, many PBRs that have come in, and because of shortfalls or problems with that public comment period, they've had to go back and hold them again. We had one comment period where an individual raised some concerns about an endangered plant that hadn't been adequately evaluated and assessed, and the applicant had to wait till the growing season for that, to do that study the following spring to be able to determine whether or not that endangered plant was going to be impacted as a result of that proposed project. So the public comment is a vital part of the process, and it can make some differences in size, footprint, a whole host of things, depending on what kinds of issues come up during that process. This is about 1/3 of the Amazon project that was permitted back in 2015. It's fully operational now, but I like to throw that up there just because it's an interesting photograph. But that was an overview in spring of 2016, wasn't it, Ken, when you sent me that? And I guess you guys were doing the overflow. You know, I got a bone to pick with Ken. They get notified or identified as the solar agency. But we're the ones that do all the work. What's with that? I don't know.
Smart.
Yeah, really. Yeah, really. So, I want to make sure that we have plenty of time for questions. And so, let's start on, yeah.
Yeah, I think we still need to wait for the microphone.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah, thank you so much. Hi, Beth.
Hi.
My name is Mark Coombs. I'm with the American Battlefield Trust. We're a national nonprofit. We save battlefield land from the Revolutionary War, War Raging 12, Civil War.
Yeah.
You had mentioned during the review process that if there are impacts to historic resources as determined by DHR, that would trigger a mitigation plan.
Correct.
Who determines, so I have kind of a multifaceted question related to that. Who determines if the mitigation plan is satisfactory? What if that entity does not deem the plan satisfactory? Is there any outside consultation involved, and are there any guidelines for what that kind of mitigation should include? I.e., is it just monetary, or is it?
No. Good question. And the prime example is we recently permitted a facility that was proposed over a known historic Civil War hospital. Talk about potential for cultural resource impacts. So what happens is the applicant is required to get a consultant, if they don't have it in-house, that meets the Department of Interior standards. They have to be licensed and certified as being a competent archaeological and architectural cultural resource expert. Generally, because the size of these facilities can get really, really big, over 1,000 acres, the applicant and their consultant works with the cultural resource expert at DEQ, of which we have one on staff, as well as the staff at DHR, to determine how they are going to assess and evaluate this massive chunk of property. The archaeological guys have got a pretty good idea of where they expect cultural resources to be found, normally along waterways, wetland areas, etc. And they determine a modeling strategy. Again, all this has to be approved and signed off by DHR before they go out and do the work. Hopefully, because if they do work that hasn't been approved by DHR, guess who's doing that cultural resource analysis again? And that's happened. So we strongly encourage the applicant to make upfront coordination with us at DHR. They come up with a modeling strategy, or if the site is small enough, they do it according to the standard 50-foot shovel test grid, and they now analyze and look at all the finds, and the cultural expert, their consultant, will propose, we found 8 issues that we think are potentially significant. DHR and DEQ review that, and maybe we find 20. We go back and say, no, there's a whole lot more that we think here are potentially significant, and you now need to develop a plan on how you're going to protect those. Protection choice is avoidance. If they can't avoid it, then they need to go to a phase 2 analysis. And all of this is a step-by-step process in conjunction with the experts over at DHR. We take their assessment. We have a cultural resource expert on staff, but DHR will make the final determination as to whether or not their mitigation plan is acceptable. And if it isn't, then I write the letter of incomplete. See how that works? Somebody else makes the decision and I do all the work. No, so I will send a letter that says your application is incomplete, and I will identify the issues that don't pass muster with DHR. The applicant then has a choice to go back, rework their mitigation plan so that it does meet approval with DHR or not. But the application won't be approved until Department of Conservation and Recreation has signed off, Game and Inland Fisheries has signed off, and Department of Historic Resources has signed off. And we have had many projects that have gone through many revisions of mitigation plans.
Can I ask just a real quick clarification on the beginning of the process? Does it start with bench review? So you take the database that's available at DHR or Natural Heritage or whatever, and that's the beginning for the inquiry into whether or not a resource would be impacted. If there's a preliminary finding, then the applicant needs to go do a field study? Is that?
Well, they do. There's a structure on how one does these assessments. The first thing is a phase 1 study, phase 1A, I think is what it's called, an analysis, and that gives a pretty big overview of whether or not there's a potential. And DHR has to approve that phase 1A study before they go on to the next step. As I said, we have had some applicants that have said, we got this, and they put their stuff together and they submit it, and it's like, And so they spend a lot of time going back and doing things again, sometimes 3 or 4 times, until they get it right. So, but DHR has a very definitive process by which these cultural resource analysis are done, and the applicant has to follow them. Yeah.
Hi there. My name is Rex Young. I work for Cooperative Solar out of Durham, North Carolina. I wanted to ask if you could go into the weeds a little bit for me, if you will, about the distinction between projects of different sizes. For example, I noticed that the fee schedule didn't address projects smaller than 5 megawatts, and I wondered if all of the components, as I understand it, some of the components don't necessarily apply to smaller projects, and if you don't mind to address that, that'd be really helpful. Thank you.
Sure. I have another slide that shows all that stuff. Really, the PBR does cover everything from 500 kV up to 150 megawatts. The difference is that you only need to meet all the 15 criteria for projects that are either greater than 5 megawatts or impact an area of greater than 10 acres. If you fall in either one of those, say you're 4.5 megawatts, but you're using 20 acres, that puts you under what we call Section 130. That's considered a de minimis project. You still are required to notify us. You still are required to submit a certification that the local government says that your project comports with all local zoning requirements. And that's the only notification to us that the applicant is required to do. If you're under 500, we don't even know. And I didn't spend a lot of time there because I can barely keep track of the stuff that's over 5, much less the stuff that's under 5 and what's considered de minimis. I have a listing right now that I have been keeping a running track of that says I've got about 35 megawatts in de minimis projects that have notified me. I suspect that maybe 10% of those de minimis projects have actually notified DEQ as to, their local certification and their notice of intent.
I'm sorry, just to clarify, is there an acreage threshold that you cross that you're no longer a de minimis project? Did you say 10 acres?
Over 10 acres.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so if you're 3 megawatts and you're impacting 15 acres or 10.1 acres, you need to go through the whole PBR. I wouldn't recommend that. I'd recommend that you get more efficient panels so that you can minimize your costs.
Me too.
First off, I'm glad I took out my slides that I was going to use in my presentation. Your numbers are way off of mine. Regarding what you just talked about and the historical review and all of the shovel pit tests and all these other things that the developer has to do, if a Walmart wanted to come in and pop up a super center, would they have to do any of that?
I don't know about a Walmart, because I understand we had some issues about battlefield impacts with Walmart a couple
Well,
of
not
years
just battlefield.
But if you're a housing development and you want to occupy that 400-acre soybean field and put up houses, you don't do any cultural resource analysis for that at all. So I will tell you that developers that came in early in the project were pulling their hair out. Oh my God, we don't have to do this in any other state. This is horrible. What are you guys doing? I said, you're in Virginia, for starters. We value our cultural resources and we've got a lot of them. And number 2, we're the only permitting program that I am aware of in the country that provides the certainty that industry has been screaming about for decades. You do everything you're supposed to do here, and you get your permit. That's certainty. Oh, and did I mention that we have to make a determination within 90 days of you submitting your permit? That involves the consultation with all the sister agencies, etc. So the developers that have been through this process a couple of times are now like, oh, we love that Virginia permitting program because we know exactly what's required. The localities may make some determinations about your conditional use permits, but that's unique and specific to the individual locality. The other thing I will mention, and just real quick, we had an awful lot of inquiry early in January, well really since the program began, about the desire to want to ensure pollinators are planted or are part of this process. We at the state level can't mandate pollinators because we don't have the statutory or regulatory authority to tell a developer that your 1,200-acre facility must be planted with pollinators. But what we've done is we've undertaken just this summer an RFP that has 5 tasks. This RFP will be announced shortly, we hope, to start the actual work this fall. On the DCR webpage, they have a scorecard that's a solar development scorecard. I encourage you all to go to DCR's webpage. That scorecard breaks out a whole host of various criteria, not just seed mix, but a whole host of other environmental things that developers can do, and ranks their project as to how high they will score as to whether or not their development is going to be an environmentally enhancing facility. DCR has got a manual that identifies plants. The result of this RFP is going to provide a web access and an app, so a developer in whatever county can click that app and get the 15 best growing pollinators for that particular soil climate based on region within Virginia. We're also having the RFP address the task of developing a market business plan, so that if you're a farmer and you want to start growing Virginia native seed that's going to be used to help spread pollinators through the 600 miles of pipeline and the more than 300,000 acres that are projected for solar facilities alone, we're going to need a whole lot of seed. There's going to need to be a whole new industry that is created around the development of encouraging and wanting pollinators to be, if at a minimum, around the buffer area. But I will tell you, Dominion found out very quickly with that facility in the Eastern Shore that it got to be really expensive mowing turf grass 12 months a year, 7 days a week. Those are long-term costs for a 30-year proposed project that become enormous. Whereas if pollinators are planted and they only need to be mowed twice a year, you can enhance the environment, you provide native habitat for grouse and pheasant and a whole host of little ground dwellers, as well as cut your maintenance costs enormously. So we're hoping that the developers really begin to look at the long-term costs of just putting turf grass in and mowing it for both soil erosion and control as well as habitat enhancement. So.